This is Adrenaline Radio. You're listening to Adrenaline Motorsports. I had hooked up with Frank Icano, and he had raced a couple of cars that were immaculate in detail, and they had also GMC engines and mounted in each of his cars. And he had 3 different ones, painted orange and black, and had the number 99 on the door or on the side of the vehicle. One was this 33 Ford Coupe that had a Jimmy in it, which was a beautiful piece of work. It was a piece of art. He had a 29 Roadster with the same thing, a Jimmy in it, and then he had built a Dragster, which again had a Jimmy in it, and he had done exceptionally well. And he was the up-and-comers in the day, but as times started to come and move forward with new models of engines, he got to the point to where he couldn't compete anymore. Because he only ran GMC inline 6-cylinder engines, and that was the era of small block Chevys, and that was what Nick Arias was noted for, and that's what he built for the coupe that Mr. Ichikawa owned, which was I drove for, which was David Ichikawa. And all of these guys came out of downtown L.A. I mean, they were just right near the convention center. And we had a little group there, and Dale hung out there. Dale Smart did, and we'd all meet on Saturdays at a garage called Stoddard Automotive, and Hal Stoddard was the guy who was the owner of the shop, and that was an interesting place to be on Saturdays, and everybody gathered there, and there were other guys that had 53 Studebakers with Oldsmobile engines in them, and 2 especially cars that were exceptionally nice. One was a car owned by a fellow by the name of Don Rhodes, and he was the brain trust. He was 10 steps above everybody else and ahead of everybody else, and all this exotic stuff with fuels and what have you. And then his pal Fred Gork, Mansford Gork, he had another Studebaker, which was a twin to Don Rhodes' car. So this was one of the gathering points, the Stoddard Automotive and Olympic Boulevard there near downtown L.A. And Arias used to come over there, but he had his own shop further west on Kenmore at the family's home, and this is what he did there. It wasn't really a professional garage. He did all his work in his parents' garage back in the early days. And Nick also basically built an engine for the coupe that I was driving, which was a alcohol burning engine, which was the GMC that he ran. And we went to El Mirage Dry Lake for the first time. I joined a club that he had been a member of for some time called the Screwdrivers, and that club ran with the Rosetta Timing Association, which doesn't exist today. But I became a member and also a member of the Screwdrivers, and so I got to drive this coupe with the Jimmy in it. And in those days, running 150 miles an hour, which we did in that coupe, was quite an experience. And I was in my early 20s during that era. And so we ran back in those days together, and that's how I met Nick and got to be buddies with him in the early days. And but who knew that I was actually going to be working for him in the latter stages of my life and being involved with his projects. And that was the point of my sharing with you the story of how when you're out there and you meet people, you don't know how all these people that you meet are going to affect your life. And sure enough, I got involved with, again, after we got rid of the altered coupe and we bought Frank Icano's coupe, Dale and I were now partners on the coupe, and we started to build an engine for it because it came without engine. It had a quick change rear end, and it was a beautiful piece of work. And we were starting to build an Oldsmobile engine because that we thought was the engine of that era that we would want to run. Never thought much of anything else. In the midst of our building of an engine, Dale came to me one day and he says, "Well, you know, we're going to put quite a bit of money into this thing, and what's going on out there is, they're getting involved with fuel dragsters, and why don't we build a dragster and sell this coupe, and a dragster will be easy to work on." And I didn't realize at that time what I was getting myself into. So basically, I agreed to it. So what we did was that we decided to sell the coupe, and to this day, I don't know who ended up with it because I really would like to find that coupe. It's pretty historical at this point. In fact, I ran into Frank Icano here about a year ago at the Hot Rod Reunion in Bakersfield, and he came to me. He's hoping that I would know who owned that coupe. He would like to have it back and restore it and have it in the Hot Rod Museum there in Pomona. And I told him I was really embarrassed to tell him that I didn't know where we sold it to because in those days we didn't think about those things. And again, it was a classic, and we had no idea. And between that coupe and other vehicles that I had purchased later on, they were also classics. And one ended up in nostalgia cackle fests, which I'll talk to you about here in a moment. But anyway, Dale and I started sketching on a piece of paper what kind of a dragster we would like to have, and we really didn't spend a lot of time out at the drags looking at them. We decided to put our own design together. So I told him, I says, okay, I'll go buy the tubing, and I'll go to Long Beach and go there at Signal Hill Community, and there's a tubing place up on the hill called H&L Tube Bending, and we'll bend up all the tube, and we'll come back, and we'll from the design that you have, we'll start putting this thing together, and we'll notch and weld and notch and weld. Dale was quite a welder, and he was very handy, and he also had a big place in which we could do this kind of work. And it took us about a year to build this car because we were trying different things and putting Oldsmobile rear end in it and hooking it up. And we had a direct drive hookup with this engine setup. And but we didn't have an engine. So we found another gentleman who we had met at the drag strip in the neighborhood, a young man by the name of Eddie Flournoy. Eddie back in the early days of drag racing, hung around the likes of, again, another old-time drag racer, which nobody remembers because it's before a lot of your time, a fellow by the name of Jazzy Nelson. And Eddie said that, yeah, he had a small block Chrysler he'd like to run in our car, and he'd like to, it was a fuel engine, and he knew all about fuel engines. And I says, well, we don't know much about fuel engines, but let's give it a shot. So it ended up being I think a 331 Chrysler is what it ended up being, and sure enough, it was set up for fuel, and I invested in a blower drive I went and bought out of Bell Auto Parts over there, Les Richter's place there in Gage Avenue in Bell, California, and I was really proud. I spent a whole close to $400 buying a blower drive for this thing, and I also ordered a fuel injector from Stu Hilborn, and the reason it came to light here was that I just had an opportunity to go to Stu's 90th birthday party at his business down there in I believe it's La Quinta or somewhere in that area, and that's of course in Orange County, south near on the way to San Clemente. And I mentioned it to him, and I says, yeah, I bought one of your 4-hole fuel injectors with a cast cat hat on it and the whole thing, and it was the tall and 4-port. He says, really? Well, how did it work? And I says, well, I'm still here, and it ran good when we had it, but we were just still learning about how to use it. But it ran good for us. And fortunately enough, I took a lot of pictures of that car, and I do have them kind of in my memory bank, and I have them on my wall at home in my office now. But Dale and I began to learn how to race fuel, and I must tell you that it was quite an experience. As it worked out, Eddie had the engine, but he was never there to work on it, so it was between Dale and I to figure the thing out. And we had the blower on there. We had to figure out how to put boost in the engine and what pulleys we'd need to run and that type of thing. And we had to figure that out, and the mixture of nitromethane. So we had to go learn about nitro. We went to Don Francisco Racing Fuels to learn about those kind of things, and that in itself was an experience because Don Francisco and his wife were both chemists, degreed chemists, and they had been making racing fuel for quite some time, and he dyed his a blue color. And he always made fuel for the small little 2-cycle engines, little airplanes and 2-cycle cars that used to run on strings. They used to fly them on a string. They never were independently flown, but they were on strings, and the cars ran in circles on fuel. And so Don Francisco was very instrumental in teaching Dale, primarily more than myself, as to fuel and the mixtures of toluene with it. And we had our hydrometer there, and we bought all that paraphernalia to learn how to mix nitromethane. And, of course, when it got right down to it and putting the motor in the car, we got it, and we fired it up, and it sounded pretty stout. And we took it out to the Lions drag strip for the first time, and we got quite an experience in a learning curve as far as driving this car.